This is working, is it? Just a few words about Jonathan before he gives his talk. Dr. Jonathan Aylen has researched aerospace technology, including missile guidance systems and Britain's early atomic bombs. He has also written on innovation in rolling mill technology and on revolutionary computer use at British Rail. This lively presentation draws on his current work on refugee engineers. Dr. Aylen is a visiting researcher at the University of Manchester and a recent past president of the Newcomen Society. Although Jonathan lives in Manchester, he is a big supporter of our branch of the Newcomen Society and regularly attends our meetings. It's my pleasure to welcome Jonathan, and I'm sure that we're in for a lively discussion. Over to you, Jonathan.
Thank you. Okay. Tonight, I want to tell you a story so you can sit back and enjoy. It's a very old-fashioned story of a good man triumphing over evil. It concerns a Jewish engineer, Ludwig Loewy, who was treated in a shocking way by the Nazis, but who came good in spectacular fashion on exile in Britain when he arrived here from 1936. I make no apologies for telling yet another story about the Second World War or the Holocaust, as these events defined the 20th century in a way that almost nothing else did. This paper is also intended as a lesson in history. History is rewritten both by the victors and the vanquished. History is partisan, very fragile, and if you don't look after it, it will disappear if not nurtured. We'll see that the Nazis rewrote the history of the engineering firm Schliemann in 1940. But in case you feel smug, our own British government official history is written in the 1950s and make no mention whatsoever, surprisingly, of the role of the Germans in our rearmament program leading up to the Second World War. Credit is not given where it's due. This is also a Sheffield story, as will become apparent obliquely as we go through. This project is part of a research on refugee engineers and industrialists. I'm also looking at a number of other refugees, particularly Franz Königsberger, who ended up as a professor at UMIST. But anyway, sit back and enjoy the story, and I hope you'll be astonished by some of the revelations. The first half is about aircraft and sets the scene. So if you're an aircraft geek, you'll love that bit. And the second part is about Ludwig Loewy. Let me start by showing you a very familiar like the audience, really. Why did it not work? Hang on, short intermission. We're trying to get the slides to move forward. Sorry? Okay. Hang on. It's gone to sleep. It's gone to sleep. I hope you out there in the audience have not gone to sleep. Sorry. We're still here, don't worry. Aha. Okay. I hope those of you who are geeks in the audience will recognize this is a Mark I Spitfire, made, of course, as we'll explain during the progress of the lecture, made from aluminium alloy and stress skin construction. The interesting point is that it has a two-bladed wooden propeller. Why? Because we didn't have the manufacturing capacity at that stage to make three-bladed aluminium propellers, because we hadn't imported the machinery from Germany just yet. This is why this Jewish engineer is so important to the war effort. We see here Ludwig Loewy with the First Lord of the Admiralty 20 months after leaving Germany. We have Ludwig here on the right as a guest of honour at the opening of the Chesterfield Heavy Tube Department. And there behind his shoulder is Earl Stanhope, First Lord of the Admiralty, who was, of course, the political head of the Navy, who was subsequently supplanted by Churchill himself long after this photo was taken. So Ludwig Loewy is going to turn out to be rather crucial to the story of rearmament and aircraft development. And he was, as you'll discover, going to become something of a celebrity engineer during the early wartime period. For instance, here is an example. His projects were given full page coverage in the Times. Movie Tone News turned up to the opening, and the BBC sent one of the various Dimblebys who were around at the time to cover the opening. This is all within a few months of him coming as an exile to Britain. So Ludwig Loewy is going to turn out to be crucial to the British war effort. But in order to explain why he was so important to the war effort, I first have to tell you one or two basic facts which are not familiar about the way in which Britain rearmed during the 1930s. And one particular key component that I'm going to talk about is extrusion presses. Ludwig Loewy's German firm, Schlermann, from which he was exiled, dominated the global supply of extrusion presses, which were essential for forming aluminium alloys for the new generation of aircraft. This is one with his name on it, Loewy, up at Distington in Cumbria at a high-duty alloys factory that they developed from 1940 onwards. But just in case you're unfamiliar with extrusion presses, let me give you an animated example. With luck, this will work. What you can see is some hydraulic cylinders in the background and some cylinders that move. So what you do is you push a hot billet, there a mandrel comes forward, puts a hole in it, and then it pushes the hot billet under tremendous pressure through to form a tube coming out the other end. It's a way of forming aluminium alloys, stainless steel, and a number of other useful wartime materials. Fortunately, this technology was dominated by the Germans. Okay, let me shock you with 4 facts about Britain's pre-war rearmament. The first one is just how far and how fast UK aircraft production expanded during the 1930s. Between 1934 and the height of the bomber program in 1944, UK aircraft output, adjusted by weight and volume and complexity, rose almost exactly 100 times, 100-fold. So you imagine any other industry in a decade, in 10 years, expanding 100-fold, most of that between about 1936 and 1942. Secondly, as I will illustrate, aircraft switched from being a branch of the furniture industry because they were fabric-covered wooden biplanes to monoplanes made of these modern sophisticated aluminium and magnesium alloys. Okay, that much may be familiar to those of you who are very keen on going to air shows and very keen on the way the aircraft industry developed. Facts 3 and 4 are somewhat more unknown and shocking. The third fact that I wish to develop is the way in which the whole of this aircraft expansion relied on specialised machinery imported from Germany at a time of growing tension, particularly from Schliermann, a firm in Düsseldorf. And fourthly, that UK rearmament was informed very strongly by German materials, German design, German production practice, German innovation. We were, in short, borrowing from the Germans at a heady pace during the late 1930s. For those of you who don't want to follow this in more detail, there's far more information in the paper on the Newcomen website that I've just published on it. Okay, so to sum up, the RAF that won the Battle of Britain depended almost entirely on German machinery and know-how imported into Britain. All right. Now, in this crazy world that we have in the 1930s, some famous German planes were, of course, prototyped with Rolls-Royce engines in unusual places like Sweden. So I believe, for instance, the Stuka and the ME-109 first flew with Rolls-Royce engines. So having upset some of your preconceived notions, let's develop some of these points in more detail. So first of all, it's very hard to measure the output of the aircraft industry in 1934 because no one bothered collecting statistics. It was very easy to establish how many horses there were and whether they were employed by the railways or in heavy draft or for recreational purposes. But the aircraft industry, no one's interested in that. So the official statistics are almost silent, certainly until 1935 on these things. But you can construct an index which goes from, as you can see, from 34 to 44. So if that index is 17 in 1934, it's literally risen by slightly over 100 times by 1944 by the height of the bomber program. Secondly, as I said, there was radical change in aircraft design. So much so that when rearmament was being planned, the government didn't actually know what type of aircraft they would be needing when the factories were being built as part of the shadow factory program and as part of the extension of the existing aircraft factories. These two pictures show front-line bomber aircraft for the RAF 4 years apart. When the Luftwaffe, came on an exchange visit to see the RAF, they were introduced to the Handley Page Hayford Mark III, which was, of course, the cutting edge of technology in 1938. It was essentially string, wire, a bit of steel frame, a lot of woodwork, and a biplane with fixed undercarriage. 4 years later, you have a Merlin-powered Lancaster built B1. This one was actually built in 1942. So that is a measure of the pace of technical change. This has retracting undercarriage. It has 4 Merlin engines, which are far, far more powerful, a speed perhaps twice that of the Hayford, if not more, and all stress skin construction. Essentially, it's made up, the structure of it's made up with lots of extruded aluminium and lots of rolled aluminium alloy sheets. So very dramatic technical progress in aircraft design. And in order to supply this new industry, a complete new basic industry, and those are the official history words, not mine, a complete new basic industry emerged to manufacture and fabricate aluminium alloys and magnesium alloys in the UK for aircraft. 4 or 5 firms, all private, expanded rapidly on the back of a phenomenally fast-growing market in the hope that they would be that peace wouldn't break out. Otherwise, they'd have been left with a hell of a lot of German equipment. And then the government eventually moved in. This is, for instance, a shadow factory first built on land at the back of Workington, at Distington in Cumbria for high-duty alloys. We'll see some others as we go on. So a complete new industry emerged to supply the new generation of aircraft. Some of you may remember your grandparents talking about the drive for saucepans and kettles. It's a myth that they weren't useful. It turned out that saucepans and kettles were a better source of aluminium than much of the scrap that was lurking around at the time. They turned out to be ideal for alloying into aerospace materials. But about the time of the Dunkirk evacuation, there was this scrap drive to collect old saucepans and kettles. That was just one symptom of this rise of a new basic industry. But why should we depend upon the Germans? Well, the answer is the Germans had total leadership in aluminium and aluminium alloys during the 1930s. Not the Americans, who had barely begun. The Canadians were producing the raw metal, but it was the Germans that led the way. And by 1938, that they were the world's largest aluminium producer. They had the know-how and made a quarter of the global output of the metal. This is why, of course, all those British component suppliers went off to Germany, indulging in industrial espionage, lurking around, looking at their bright, shiny new factories in order to learn tricks. And they did learn tricks and adopted them extremely quickly. And what was this aluminium to make? Well, it was to make Luftwaffe aircraft. From about 1935, the expansion of the Luftwaffe had become public knowledge in Germany and had become an avowed aim. And they demonstrated their effect by siding with Franco in the Spanish Civil War. And so this is actually fairly obsolete, the Stuka, by 1940. But they'd shown that stressed skin aluminium alloy construction was the way forward. Okay, this was not a new thing. Germany had long had leadership in aluminium. They pioneered the use of an aluminium alloy called duralumin in airships during the First World War. Yeah, so this is where a lot of their know-how. And Junkers led the way. Although in Britain, when he spoke to the Royal Aeronautical Society, you will not see an account of the discussion, unusually, of his paper, because it was derided as junk. You can see the obvious pun on Junkers. Fortunately, one or two people could see through it and did actually buy licenses to manufacture duralumin in Britain. And, for instance, the Aluminium Rolling Company of Warrington became a convert. But the US in particular and the UK very reluctant to adopt these German ideas of all-metal aeroplanes during the 1920s. A brief footnote here, it didn't do Junkers any good because Junkers would not collaborate with Hitler over military aircraft. Vision was for civil aircraft, and he eventually died under house arrest, I believe, just before the Second World War. But so in Britain, we had to catch up. And this new basic industry that emerged relied upon German know-how, German machinery, and German manufacturing practice. And they were especially reliant upon the new technology of aluminium extrusion. The problem is that when you cast aluminium, it's just an amorphous mass of crystals. It has no strength. Alloying helps, but you need to form it in some way in order to impart the crystalline structure. One answer, of course, was to cast it in billets and roll it. That's how, for instance, Northern Aluminium at Banbury and the British Aluminium Rolling Company at Warrington started out. But the best way to do this was to form it in extrusion press. And then it could be worked further, and then you could form it into a final shape in yet another extrusion press, a wing spar, for instance, or a ridged strengthening or former for a fuselage. Problem is, we didn't have any extrusion presses. All right. We're about 3 or 4 in Britain in the early 1930s. We had to go find them. Okay. Sorry, for some reason it's going back. That's because I'm holding it upside down. I do apologize. Okay. And it's not only extrusion presses that we needed. We wanted presses for aluminium propeller blade blanks, for aircraft pistons. A Merlin engine, for example, is about 2/3 to 3/4 aluminium and magnesium alloy. It would be too heavy if it was made from steel. It needs to be made from something, for instance, forged aluminium alloy for the pistons, for the conrods, for the crankshafts, for the crankcases cast, and so on. We also needed then expertise in aluminium rolling and in casting machinery, and we even bought complete factories from them. All right? Now, this poor slide, I apologize, it's a bit dark. It's from a glass negative, but this is a Schlerman extrusion press, which is going to turn out to be very important because stainless steel extrusion was pioneered in Chesterfield, led by Ludwig Loewy, who had agreed to help them. Up until that point, stainless steel was not extruded as a material because of the high temperatures involved, the dye wear, the problems of lubrication, and so on. But Ludwig Loewy persisted with this plant at Chesterfield and got his feet under the table, shall we say. He established an affinity with Britain from pioneering stainless steel tube manufacture. That, of course, went on to become the framework for a number of Second World War aircraft that were built with tubes rather than fabrications. But for instance, this is how we got our Spitfire propeller blades. This is a huge Schlerman press at Slough, at High Duty Alloys in Slough, forging propeller blade blanks for Spitfires and subsequently Hurricanes. So, for instance, Hurricanes just managed to get 3-blade variable pitch propellers fitted in time for the Battle of Britain, which enhanced their performance. Firms like Rotol and so on were able to manufacture them and mass produce them in large numbers just in time for the Battle of Britain. This quite clearly says on it, Schlerman across the entablature. Came straight from Germany in 1939. Of course, there was a downside to all this. This meant when the Blitz broke out, the Germans knew where to go. They knew where exactly to go. They marked it in red on the Ordnance Survey map. They supplied the damn plant. So the people who built it could tell them exactly. And there are loads of target maps like this, all for places full of German machinery. And of course, they were prime targets. Slough, as it happened, was hit by one stray bomb. Northern Aluminium at Banbury was so important for the war effort that they got technicians in from one of the film studios to build a replica 2 miles further north. Okay. It was duly bombed by a very attentive German. The replica was bombed, but High Duty, the Northern Aluminium Company in Banbury retained their production, which is just as well because it constituted something like 1/3 of all the rolled sheet was made there that went into British aircraft. So this is Northern Aluminium in 1931. That's quite simply a greenfield site. In other photos of the site, you can see sheep grazing in this field in front. This was to expand hugely between 1931 and the beginning of the war, as it became one of the premier supply centres for the Air Force. And those are the pigs of aluminium that came in from the Canadian owners. That's why it was called Northern Aluminium. And of course, it subsequently went on to be known as Alcan and so on. Okay. But if we went inside that shed, walked past the sheep and went into this brand new plant, what will we find? Have a mill from Achenbach Buschhütten in Siegen in Germany, newly built and supplied. Remember that name, Uchenbach Bush Hutton. It's not connected with Loewy, but it is going to crop up as a major supplier to the British aluminium industry. For example, Birmingham Metals, built a brand new greenfield plant, the Woodgate Works at Quinton near Birmingham on a greenfield site. Almost every single item of equipment came from Germany. In fact, I can't find any that were British apart from the odd heat furnace. This is a press from Schlerman's competitor, Umoco, who never normally exported, but somehow Birmingham Metals managed to persuade them to buy it. They also had a Schlerman extrusion press alongside this. And when they advertised in the Aircraft Production Trade Journal in November 1938, 10 months before war broke out, there you see sheet alloy perfection by rigid rolling control, and there is our Achenbach German rolling mill. It was a point of honor that you had German equipment. All right? Sometimes this caused problems. This is a lovely piece from the Warrington Guardian, which I'm sure is regular reading for all of you. And in 1945, they celebrated the end of the war by doing a roundup of all the local firms and their contribution to the war effort. Okay? So they said, isn't it remarkable? 2 of the strip rolling mills that were completed just before the outbreak of war, one of the widest mills in existence for the preparation of aluminium sheets, they just managed to fit them before the outbreak of war. These 2 63.5-inch wide mills were supplied by another firm, Schmitz of Germany, and in fact were still working in rebuilt form in this photo of 1962. You can't see them any longer, but you can see the go-kart track that's taken their place. I thought you might like a colour photo at this point to relieve the black and white history. Okay. Banbury, Northern Aluminium, we've seen they set up this works which was growing at breakneck speed amongst the sheep fields north of Banbury, down close to the Oxford Canal. 2 extrusion presses supplied by Loewy's former company, Schlerman, more of that in a minute, were almost complete when war broke out, so the technicians were interned because they were caught in Britain on September the 3rd. Okay, so Schlerman, the leading supplier of extrusion presses in the world, was still building 2 at Banbury in September 1939. And we can go on, and I could bore you till midnight on other examples. Okay. This was recognized at the time. I'm not telling you anything that was new to aluminium makers at the time, because the trade journal Aircraft Production said one of the obvious results of this situation, in other words, the outbreak of war, will be the cessation of the supply of tools and equipment from Germany. Okay, what a blow. Our enemy will no longer be able to supply the tools and equipment. And I should say, incidentally, this is the funny thing, and this is so good. If you go through the trade journals for the late 1930s and early 1940s, they are full of German articles. And they officially said in one of the editorials, it would be stupid to stop telling you about German production techniques. We've learned so much from them that we're going to carry on publishing this backlog of articles on German production techniques so that they can help you. Okay, and that's one of the better examples, but there are lots of other lovely examples. There's some just wonderful examples, but we haven't got time, perhaps in questions. Okay, I said industrial espionage. There's a lovely autobiography of George Doughty that was edited by Ali McConnell, if she's listening, a thank you to her, because she inspired me on some of this. George Doughty used to go on scouting trips to Germany. He came across Buna synthetic rubber and copied that. He saw castings in magnesium alloy at the leading company, later called Mahler, at Cannstatt near Stuttgart, and he adopted that. Okay? People just went there. Fed and all the people went to Germany and copied what the Germans were doing wholesale. Okay, I trust you've got the picture that British rearmament, the RAF winning the Battle of Britain, the later Bomber Command raids on Germany were essentially all dependent upon the Germans. Thank you very much. We learned from them, we bought equipment from them, and we bombed them. Okay, it was very cheap too, but that's another digression. Now, this is why the subject of tonight's lecture, Ludwig Loewy, is so important. Because this man is one of the world's, if not the world's leading expert in presses for aluminium alloys at the time of his departure from Germany to Britain. It's as if the leading chip designer left Intel and went up to Taiwan and set up an industry, which of course exactly is what happened. Yep. Ludwig Loewy was that leading chip designer. Okay, let me tell you something about his history. He was not a German Jew, but a Czech. He was born somewhere that I can't pronounce, west of somewhere in Czechoslovakia. He went to the Technische Hochschule in Vienna and started work with a well-known rolling mill firm, SAC, before being persuaded to move across to Edward Schliemann, arguably by Schlieman's son-in-law, Poole Maltholt. Of him in a minute and more off the record at question time. Loewy joined there in 1914, meteoric rise, became chief engineer and technical manager in 1915, and was joint owner by 1920. Although whether he owned 50% or 45% is not clear. It's extremely murky, that point, and I would dearly love to know more. Okay, Schliemann, this is their office block in Dusseldorf before it was bombed during the Second World War, although the reconstructed one looks very similar. Schliemann was a trading company that moved, fortunately, to hydraulic controls. I don't want to bore you, but if you want to discuss in question time, there's an obvious problem with a hydraulic control because you have a staggering pressure on one side of the valve and no pressure on the other. Just think about it. Okay, so they moved into hydraulic controls and got into presses to kill the British and the French during the First World War. They had very close links with the leading and long-established German engineering firm GHH because they relied upon GHH subsidiaries essentially to manufacture the equipment they designed. Process contract. They designed, innovated, sold, and procured the equipment, then erected it in their customers' factories, including Banbury in September 1939. And Ludwig Loewy very quickly rose to lead them to innovate in two areas. One was hydraulic presses and the other one was rolling mill design. He was, if you like, a man of startling energy, great creativity. I managed to find 27 of his name so far, and I'm sure I haven't found all. Some of them were actually from the Czech Republic when the French briefly occupied the Ruhr. And he was an incredibly productive, energetic, go-getting guy, an excellent salesman, excellent designer, and really good at getting stuck into technical problems like extruding stainless steel in Chesterfield. So he built up Schliemann almost single-handedly alongside his partner, Poole Maltholt. He led a large export effort to the USA. Remember, the USA didn't have an aluminium industry to speak of in the 20s. He was selling copper, presses for copper. Only later did they get orders from the emerging Alcoa. He went to Japan, he sold in the Soviet Union, and then he moved to Britain. So much so that Schliemann, facing the troubles of the German economy, was 90% export during the 1930s. According to Schliemann sources, particularly the rolling mill business, for instance, selling to Russia, was extremely profitable. He recruited his brother Erwin. We can tell you much more about that at question time. But it wasn't smooth going, as you might think. Quite apart from the export travel, his partner, Poole Maltholt, was found to be embezzling money from the firm. Why this should be is not clear. It is said that he was funding the completely indigent Nazi party. The Nazi party had no funds, particularly in the early 1930s. They later got good at shaking down businessmen, but at that stage they weren't very good at shaking anyone down, and they learned very fast, shall we say. But it's arguable, but he actually had rather, how shall we say, expensive tastes. He supported rather a lot of artists. He had an unfortunate mining venture and so on. And so Paul Mountop basically stole the bearer shares from the fridge and a few more of Ludwig Loewy's and went off. And after much shenanigans, they ended up in the hands of GHH. So there was Ludwig Loewy owning roughly half the firm, perhaps 45%, and GHH, their main supplier, owning the rest. Right. We know, incidentally, how good Ludwig Loewy was at building up Schliemann. This is an advert from a Nazi wartime sales brochure. Nazi wartime sales brochure. As you can see in the background, it says Blaenavon Ironworks on the truck. Okay, that's a Nazi wartime sales brochure, right? Okay. Now, Ludwig Loewy was also a canny guy, right? He took a lot of time, what I called anticipating affinity with Britain. He joined the British Institute of Metals, which was a rather unlikely thing to do, but he and one of his colleagues, Hugo Laurent, joined in November 1929. So he became a key figure in Britain's Institute of Metals. He started a sales drive in the UK. And as we can see, he spent an enormous amount of time in Chesterfield. And let's be honest, would you want to spend an enormous amount of time in Chesterfield in the early 1930s? You probably wouldn't. Developing extrusion of stainless. We know from correspondence, he was on corresponding terms with Ludwig Mond, who was, of course, Baron Melchett from March 1936, and who was one of the driving forces behind ICI. His niece, who's very informative and exceptionally helpful on all this, said that actually he spent a lot of time in the UK from about 1933 onwards, which is, of course, when the Nazis came to power. So Adolf Hitler was elected Chancellor in 1933, and from almost that moment, Jews were officially discouraged from holding any management posts in leading German companies. This was the beginning of the end for Jewish business in Germany. And Schliemann was particularly vulnerable because most of the senior engineers were actually Jewish. And so when Ludwig Loewy decided to flee to Britain in 1936, his senior Jewish colleagues were keen to come with him, meaning that the intellectual know-how German, the world's leading extrusion supplier at a time of global rearmament of aircraft, all went from Dusseldorf to London in 1936 because of Nazi persecution of the Jews. Okay. His brother, Erwin, who was minding the shop while Ludwig was away, was intimidated out of Germany because he was courting a Gentile at the time. And here they used to meet in the street and go off for an innocent evening. Someone took a pot shot at him because he was a Jew courting a Gentile. That night he fled to Britain. On the boat train, and his wife-to-be Margaret eloped the next day, and they got married in Bournemouth. Okay, so Ludwig may have chosen to leave in 1936, but he's seen the way his brother was treated just for courting a Gentile. Of course, it was against the law from 1935 onwards. Okay. Now, Ludwig Loewy left, as we'll see, left Dusseldorf for Britain, but he still owned a huge share of Schliemann. And so what he said to GHH was, we'll cooperate. will have they had a verbal agreement that he'd effectively act as their export agent. Remember, of course, that virtually all their sales are exports anyway, will act as the export agent, but that didn't happen. He flew back to Germany to develop this relationship soon after he'd moved to Britain in April 1936, only to be told the Gestapo were after him, and he flew back and turned up back at Croydon with 10 Reich marks and a suitcase. Okay, so that was the end, and he certainly didn't get any money that had been promised from GHH to support their overseas offices, and he was effectively written out of Schleurmann's history and completely disregarded. Needless to say, he didn't turn up at the AGM in 1936. He sent his legal representative instead. Now, there are many questions I don't know the answer to because the government's files on Ludwig Loewy are embargoed until 2045. Why, you may ask? I don't know. Was he encouraged to leave? Others left. One of the other major losses, those of you who drive a BMW at this point can feel extremely guilty. One of the other major losses was George Sachs, who was the leading non-ferrous metallurgist in Germany. He'd been on the executive board of Dürner, which was owned by Quant. In fact, Quant actually paid his emigration fee. He fled to the United States in autumn 1936. He'd obviously seen that Ludwig had gone and decided to clear off too. So Germany was very good at losing all their non-ferrous metals expertise. It wasn't just all their physicists that fled, it was all the people who were most crucial to the war effort that fled. Okay, what happened next? Answer: Ludwig Loewy set up a new firm in Kingsway in London, just off Kingsway in London, Loewy Engineering, with his two trusted directors, Hugo Laurent and Conrad Guttenstein, more of them in a moment, and design staff from Germany, or he recruited some more from Czechoslovakia, or he went down and recruited lots of local agency staff from Foster Wheeler and other places. A lot of women draftsmen. That will shock you. We've got photographic evidence of that. And we've also got the names as well of all this original staff. Other leading engineers joined them. For instance, one of them was sent from Schleurmann to commission a press in Belgium. He just kept traveling. Got on the boat at Ostend, turned up in London and said, I've got the drawings, you know. We know that several thousand drawings came from Schleurmann. So they not only had the know-how, not only had the brightest people, but they also had all the drawings so they could manufacture Schleurmann machinery straight off. He inspired a lot of loyalty. I won't go into all that because it's a bit sentimental. But for instance, one of his longest serving draftswomen, Peggy Dormer, wrote a very long poem called Loewyitis. And here you have it. Excellent doggerel. It goes on for about 7 pages. A man named Loewy came to town in London. He did settle down. Ludwig, Hugo Laurent, and KG's Conrad Guttenstein were pioneers of industry. Around them gathered lads and lasses. We worked for them on mills and presses, rolling, coiling, stripping, blooming, drawing, forging, and extruding. Business boomed, the office thrived, more people came from far and wide, from Britain, Europe, and the States. They found their way through lift shaft gates to join us on the 7th floor in Kingsway, and very soon the 8th floor and the 1st floor, because they pretty soon outgrew their premises. They were extremely successful. Now, this is unusual. A brand new firm, a brand new engineering firm, sets up in London with alien foreign senior directors, and within 1 month they've got 2 key orders. Admittedly, a fairly small, upsetting press to make Durand but pistons for air engines, Merlins, of course, and for Bristol engines. And also, you can understand your cockpit because Melchett was on board of ICI Metals. But to set up a brand new firm and within 30 days to have 2 key orders, that's pretty cool. It gets even cooler. Oh, this is an upsetting press for making Merlin engine. I would love to know more about this. We believe it is Lloyd Carr's in Grimsby. The people in Grimsby have been incredibly helpful, but they're just up the records. But I do have some wonderful photos of wartime manufacture at Lloyd Carr's in Grimsby. If anyone can tell me more, I would love to know. Okay. He didn't just get these regular orders for aluminium. He also won a huge prestige order for a tube plant at Chesterfield Tubes to make vital boiler tubes and condenser tubes for Admiralty warships, which had hitherto come in from, you guessed it, Germany and places like that. So he designed this giant 4-column hydraulic piercing press and the world's largest drawback bench for making them into tubes, and won this order, which was worth 113,000, which was quite a lot of money at the time. I reckon it was about 5.4 million, but you couldn't build it for less than about 150 million these days, I don't think. So there's a nicely staged photo. You can see the twisted spire in chestnut on Chesterfield Church, and here are the components coming through on Pickford vans. I'm pretty sure that the manufacture of this was subcontracted to Davy Brothers / Davy-United in Sheffield. I have spent days in the Sheffield archives to prove that. I cannot, but I do have some strong evidence that Davies were the subcontractors for this giant press. And there is an artist's impression by a Sheffield artist of this plant in operation, with a giant piercing press, which essentially just pushed a hole into a hot steel billet. When I say billet, it's actually more like a 20-ton ingot. And then this pierced tube can be pulled out into a much longer tube and shaped and formed on a draw bench. So big, hefty, solid, heavy engineering. But of course, it was a sensitive contract. The Admiralty was behind this. We've just seen in the opening slides that the First Lord of the Admiralty was present at the celebratory opening. So why on earth did the contract go to Loewy, who was an alien who just arrived in Britain with his mates? Well, one answer is, as I say, Loewy anticipated affinity with Britain. He got his feet under the table at Chesterfield Tubes by helping them pioneer stainless tube manufacture. He was a known quantity to them, and so the Admiralty, the tubing investments were willing to take a punt on Loewy as the newcomer. And of course, it was German technology. So how on earth could they acquire the German technology if they didn't go to someone like Loewy, who knew all about draw presses and piercing presses? He won other orders. He got a very similar huge order from John Summers, who were building the shot and strip mill. They faced very considerable difficulties getting components, and he built this beautiful crop shear for the slabbing mill at Shotton. In the background is the Mester blooming mill, and then it's cutting slabs off to length. This is actually an extraordinarily innovative design. Those of you into electric motors had already spotted these are squirrel cage motors, and this was a Schlerman pioneering technique. I won't go into the technical details of why squirrel cage motors are a very neat technical solution, but they were. He was essentially building a Schlerman run-out table for Shotton. Of course, when the war came out, it was said in his Institute of Metals obituary, remember he was a full member, it said in the obituary he even put more effort in. And as I said in the paper, this is technology transfer with a vengeance. All right, he had good reason to look after his adoptive country. And this, in short, is the kind of equipment that was supplied by Loewy Engineering by the time of his death in 1942. So you can see in the early 1930s, Britain had about 3 extrusion presses. He supplied 109, is it? Something like that, of various sizes, including all these other presses. Stretchers are needed to tension and flatten and alter the metallurgical properties of aluminium sheet. There's a complete propeller blade forging plant there, for instance, complete rolling mill installation for aluminium sheet, lots of smaller sheet mills. You can see he made this monumental contribution to Britain's war effort. During the war, they were evacuated. They were asked to evacuate within 6 days of war breaking out because the Ministry of Aircraft Production decided that they were so strategically important that they couldn't risk having the firm in London with an impending blitz. So by about the 10th of September, they'd had an official letter asking them to move, and they ended up in Poole at the back of Bournemouth in this house, Branksome Grange, which you can see is very crowded. And I did do the count, but roughly, I think a third of the staff there are women draftsmen. They're not tracers, they're women draftsmen who played a key role in Loewy's growth and development. Now, just to sum up, we're getting to the end. He was something of a celebrity. Remember, he's a foreigner, he's Jewish, he's come to Britain in April 1936. By 1940, he was something of a celebrity. He was technical advisor to Lord Beaverbrook, who greeted him and treated him on very friendly terms, and as far as we can judge, met him every week. Beaverbrook, I have completely altered my view about Beaverbrook, done this research, because Beaverbrook, in a most glorious and wonderful rant at the head of MI5, defended Loewy against MI5 because they were all worried that Loewy's firm was full of Germans, that they were Nazi sympathizers, they were feeding information back to the Germans, they were Jewish, they couldn't be, etc. But Beaverbrook came out with this most glorious rant that Guy Liddell recorded in great detail it's recorded in Guy Liddell's biography. He was treated with incredible deference in all communications by the Ministry of Aircraft Production. For instance, if he said, I want my internees back, because after Dunkirk, a lot of Jewish refugees interned or considered for internment in places like the Isle of Man. He said, I want my refugees back. And they said, certainly, sir. And they all came back, and that's really very well documented. The downside was he was not allowed out of Britain. The National Archives contain correspondence with the Americans saying, quite bluntly, Ludwig Loewy is too important to us to be allowed out of Britain. They wanted him to go to America to advise them on extrusion plants and presses for the burgeoning aircraft industry over there. They started to get into aluminium in a big way. His brother Irwin was running Loewy Hydropress. They wanted all this technical advice. He was not allowed to leave. He was also really rather unusually granted Britain.
Can't hear anything.
And died on October 10th, 1942. So what can we conclude from all this? Many Jewish refugees in Britain faced very difficult times. There was a lack of acceptance of their professional qualifications, particularly, for instance, in the medical area. They faced internment as enemy aliens. Lots of them joined the Pioneer Corps to escape internment. Yet Ludwig Loewy was embraced utterly and totally by the political and industrial establishment. He set up, from scratch, a highly successful startup firm which grew phenomenally fast. It went from 4 or 5 people in Kingsway to 100-something employees. And he helped lots of other Jewish and non-Jewish refugees find employment, and certainly played a very key role in the UK's rearmament, actually from before 1936. This is a bust of him done after his death by Jacob Epstein. There are 6 or 7 of these bronzes cast, I believe. I, oddly enough, used to see one when I was advising Davy way back when. But there you go. And one final note, Schlerman rewrote their history. We have the wartime brochures from Schlerman, fortunately, and they praised Paul Maltock. Guys, now we know he was excluded from the company by a court order for embezzling money in 1931. He went on and soon committed suicide thereafter in Berlin. We don't know why, but he is praised in the brochure rather than Ludwig Loewy. Schlerman went on to support the German and the Italian war effort and actually kept on marketing in the USA and Canada until war broke out, and they remained after the war with the GHH group until they merged with the Vice-controlled CMAG firm of Hilschenbach and subsequently merged with a number of other firms. So this is, for instance, part of their wartime effort, building a huge plant for Mussolini in Genoa. I have to thank a very large number of people. I've just added another one on the bottom there. Tony Butler, if you're listening, thank you very much. And a large number of people, quite a lot of archives, and 2 really exceptionally good at referees. But if you know any more, please, please, please get in touch. Thank you very much, David.
What a wonderful talk. That's fantastic. Well done, Jonathan.